Yeas, 48 nays. The bill is passed.
Reconsider. Lay that on the table. Mr. President.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I now move.
Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I move to proceed to calendar number 470, 3414.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to the consideration of calendar number 470 as 3414, a bill to enhance the security and resiliency of the cyber and communications infrastructure of the United States.
I have a cloture motion which has been filed at the desk. I ask it be reported.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 470 as 3414, a bill to enhance the security and resiliency of the cyber and communications infrastructure of the United States, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, finally,
Senator from Nevada.
I rise with great pleasure to honor my colleagues, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont and Dick Lugar of Indiana, as they reach a milestone in their careers. They each cast a momentous vote just a short time ago. For Senator Leahy, the vote just cast is 14,000. It's 14,000th roll call vote. After Senator Lugar, it's interesting, same day, 1,000 votes apart. Senator Lugar's at 13,000. And these two fine men and dedicated senators share this milestone purely by coincidence. I applaud Pat Leahy, my dear friend, who has always possessed great drive to serve. Maybe it was growing up from the State House in Montpelier that put the idea in his head with such a young age. After graduating from Georgetown University Law School, Pat served as 8 years as state's attorney for Vermont before becoming a senator. He continues to exercise his fine legal mind as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Senator Leahy has led the fight against landmines, and just numerous landmark pieces of legislation, he has been the leader. Pat's loved by the people of Vermont. His intellect, his oratorical skills, his boldness, his persuasiveness are all overshadowed by one thing, Mr. President, by his teammate, Marcel. Marcel is clearly his greatest asset. I commend my colleague, Senator Lugar, on reaching his milestone of his 13,000th vote. He's a fifth-generation Hoosier, a proud Navy veteran, longest-serving member of Congress in Indiana history. He's also a bit of an overachiever, graduating first in both his high school and college classes and going on to become a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. As ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee and past chairman of the committee, having served as presiding officer for decades, he's dedicated his time in the Senate to reducing the threat of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. So it's been my distinct pleasure to watch both of these fine senators work tirelessly on behalf of their home states. So I congratulate both of them on their service and reaching this impressive milestone.
As the Majority Leader has indicated, two major legislative milestones have been reached in the Senate today by two dedicated, long-serving senators who happen to be from different sides of the aisle. I pay tribute to the senior senator from Vermont, Senator Leahy, for casting his 14,000th vote, and to the senior senator from Indiana, Senator Lugar, for casting his 13,000th vote. To put these milestones in perspective, Senator Leahy, a member of the Senate since 1975, ranks 6th on the all-time roll call vote list, most recently passing former Senator Pete Domenici. Senator Lugar, who was first elected to the Senate 2 years later in 1976, ranks 10th on the all-time list and most recently passed our former colleague and current occupant of the chair, Vice President Joe Biden. This is not only a remarkable accomplishment of longevity for both men, it's also an opportunity for their colleagues to honor them for their decades of service to the people of Indiana and of Vermont. Now, Senator Leahy isn't just the second most senior senator in this body. He's also the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and a senior member of the Agriculture and Appropriations Committee. Pat and I got to know each other pretty well alternating as chairman and ranking member of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of Appropriations for over a decade. Somehow he finds time to also be an amateur photographer and to have a blossoming movie career. And I have no doubt he gives most of the credit, of course, to Marcelle, his wife, with whom he'll be celebrating a far more important milestone in the next month, their 50th wedding anniversary. So congratulations to you, Pat, on both counts. And as for our friend, Senator Dick Lugar, I've known him going back to my first Senate campaign. He's the longest-serving member of Congress in Indiana history and one of America's most widely respected voices on foreign policy. In a career filled with many achievements and milestones, Senator Lugar's leadership on the Non-Lugar Cooperation Threat Reduction Program is, in my opinion, his greatest and most lasting achievement for the American people. Not only for the American people and for the security of this country, but for the promotion of this peace throughout the world. Because of Senator Lugar's work, thousands of nuclear warheads have been dismantled, and the world is indeed a safer place. For Senator Leahy, I know Senator Lugar would say none of this would have been possible without the love and support of his wife of 55 years, Charlene. So I congratulate them both on this milestone and join my colleagues in once again paying tribute to our two colleagues in this significant achievement. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President?
The senator from Vermont.
President, I rise to congratulate my longtime friend and colleague from Vermont, Senator Patrick Leahy, on the occasion of his 14,000th vote. That is a lot of votes. In the long history of our republic, only 6 senators have achieved that milestone before him. Born in Montpelier, Vermont, our state's capital, educated at St. Michael's High School in Montpelier, St. Michael's College in Colchester, Vermont, and Georgetown University Law School, Senator Leahy was first elected to the Senate in 1974, the first, and to this date, the only Democrat elected to the Senate from Vermont. And I remember that campaign very, very well because I was in it. And Pat Leahy got a lot more votes than I did. Before assuming the office of U.S. Senator, Pat Leahy gained a national reputation for law enforcement during his 8 years as state's attorney in Chittenden County, the state's largest county. Over his 3.5 decades here in the Senate, Patrick Leahy has done many, many remarkable things, and let me just mention a few. Cognizant of the suffering and tragedy that landmines cause for civilian populations, Patrick Leahy has led in this body, and in fact the entire U.S. government, the campaign to end the production and use of anti-personnel landmines. Many lives and limbs have been saved as a result of Senator Leahy's efforts. With similar commitment and passion, as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Patrick Leahy has led the effort to insist on fairness at the Department of Justice, to support free speech and a free press, and to require and maintain openness and transparency in government. At a time of major infringements on privacy rights in this country from both the private sector and the government, Pat Leahy has been a strong champion of civil liberties and the Constitution of the United States. Senator Leahy, reflecting Vermont's very strong consciousness regarding the need to preserve our environment, has for many years been a champion of environmental protection and has been named over and over again one of the top environmental legislators by the nation's foremost conservation organizations. He has been, as Vermonters well know, a special champion in preserving the high quality of water on Lake Champlain, our beautiful lake, and perhaps the most valuable natural resources we have in our state. Today, I congratulate, on behalf of the people of the state of Vermont, Senator Patrick Leahy on the occasion of his 14,000th vote, and look forward to working with him as closely in the future as we have worked in the past. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I want to thank, of course, the Majority Leader and the Republican Leader, friends with whom I've served for years, and we have always been friends, for their kind words. I want to thank my colleague from Vermont, another dear friend. Our careers have paralleled in many areas. The time he was mayor of our largest city to our lone representative in the House of Representatives to now my partner here in the Senate. Of course, my dear friend Dick Lugar, we've worked together so many times. We alternated between chair and ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, did a great deal in the environment, passed an organic farm bill, did so many things all the time when he was doing his invaluable work to protect our nation against nuclear weapons. Mr. President, I value the Senate. I love the Senate. It's been a major part of my life. But I was glad to hear both leaders mention the true love of my life. My wife of nearly 50 years. There is nothing I've accomplished throughout my whole public career that I could have done without Marcel's help. She raised 3 wonderful children and happened to raise 5 wonderful grandchildren. Every single day I've been a better person because when we first started the race for the Senate in 1974, few people said I could win. Marcel and I campaigned together. She always said I could. We did. None of us know how long we might be in the Senate, but I have valued every single moment here, and I will value every single moment as long as I am here. I'm glad Marcel is here. She's joined by a dear and valuable friend, Peter Welch, a congressman from Vermont, his wife, Margaret, but also so many members of my staff. I feel that I have been blessed with the finest staff any senator has ever had. And again, they are the ones every day. If I look good and do something well on this floor, I'll give the staff the credit. I joke that I'm a constitutional impediment to them totally running everything. But thank goodness they are there. So I'll speak more about this at another time. But it's a special feeling to be here with my friend Dick Lugar, to hear the kind words of my friend and colleague Bernie Sanders, to know that our other member of our delegation, we're a huge delegation, all 3 members. The other member, Peter Welch, is in the stand. But especially, we have acknowledged Marcel and Kevin, Alicia, Mark, and their families. How wonderful it is to be here. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Indiana.
what a pleasure it is to be with my colleague Pat Leahy on this very special day. It was a great coincidence that the 13,000th vote and the 14,000th should coincide this afternoon, but what a joyous moment to be with my friend on this experience. I thank once again the leader, Mitch McConnell of our party, and Harry Reid, Majority Leader of the Senate, for their very generous remarks about both Pat and me. And I joined Pat in extolling the virtues of those who have made such a difference in our lives. My wife, Charlene, our 4 sons, our 13 grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. These are very precious people who have made such a difference in my life and made it possible for me to have good health and spirits throughout all this time and to enjoy thoroughly this experience. I would just add to the remarks of my colleague that tomorrow we hope to have a little celebration in the Agriculture Committee room. Long ago, at the beginning of our careers, Pat and I were situated at the end of a long table. It stretched the length of the Agriculture Committee room. Our chairman, Herman Talmadge of Georgia, was at one end with Senator Jim Eastland of Mississippi. I'm not certain what the rules of the Senate were at that time, but I recall frequently both were enveloped in smoke at the end of the room. And it seemed to me that they were, in fact, developing whatever the policy was going to be and making decisions. As a matter of fact, sometimes they simply arose, and Pat and I were left to ponder really what had occurred. So it was appropriate that our 2 portraits should be put at the end of the table, at the entry to the Agriculture Committee room, where we once sat as the most junior members and eventually ascended to the chairmanship and great experiences together in foreign policy and ability to help feed the world. I'm grateful likewise for Joe Biden, Vice President Biden's presence today, because he was a wonderful partner in the Foreign Relations Committee for so many years. I was not aware that the Vice President would be in the chair. I told him I was somewhat embarrassed because my 13,000th vote finally eclipsed his votes, and he ranks now 11th. Joe was aware of that, had in the chair today the rankings 1 through 11, so that we're sort of all situated and still love each other in the process. I thank all senators for the honor that has been accorded and for this opportunity to address the body. This has been a great experience of my life, and this has been a very special moment, and I thank the chair.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Oh, the senator from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to address the Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you. First of all, I congratulate my colleagues, Senator Leahy and Senator Lugar, for this achievement and thank them for their service to the country. And I also appreciate the willingness of Senator Collins and Senator Lieberman for their willingness to allow me to speak just for a few minutes before we return to the business at hand, legislation regarding cybersecurity. But I wanted to point out to my colleagues and perhaps to the Department of Agriculture something that I saw today that catches my attention. And in fact, it is amazing to me, this development. This is the Department of Agriculture, USDA's employee newsletter. And in that newsletter, it says the following. It has a section in the newsletter that says Food Services Update. Well, the Department of Agriculture, which in my view has a serious and significant responsibility to promote agriculture, says this in their own newsletter. One simple way to reduce your environmental impact while dining at our cafeteria is to participate in Meatless Monday. Meatless Monday, this effort encourages people not to eat meat on Mondays. How will going meatless one day of the week help the environment? The production of meat, especially beef and dairy as well, has a large environmental impact. According to the UN, animal agriculture is a major source of greenhouse gases and climate change. It also wastes resources. It takes 7,000 kilograms of grain to make 1,000 kilograms of beef. In addition, beef production requires a lot of water, fertilizer, fossil fuels, and pesticides. In addition, there are many health concerns related to the excessive consumption of beef. Let me say that differently. Related to the excessive consumption of meat. While a vegetarian diet could have a beneficial impact on a person's health and the environment, many people are not ready to make that commitment. Because Meatless Monday involves only one day a week, it's a small change that could produce big results. Our own Department of Agriculture, again, at least from my perspective, and we ought to look at the mission of what the Department of Agriculture is, I think it will reflect what I'm saying, is to promote agriculture, to help those who every day go to work to produce food, fiber, and fuel for this country and the world. And yet our own Department of Agriculture is encouraging people not to eat meat and indicates that these statements, again, from their newsletter, the USDA headquarters food operations are a high-profile opportunity to demonstrate USDA's commitment to USDA's missions and initiatives. So it wouldn't surprise me that what you see the Department of Agriculture somehow lose this newsletter, but it's posted on their website. And I just would encourage Secretary Vilsack and the officials at the Department of Agriculture to rethink their role in discouraging something that is so vital to the U.S. economy and something so important to the Kansas economy. We are a beef-producing state and generate significant revenue for Kansas farmers and ranchers, and is one of the items that improves our balance of trade as we export meat and beef around the world. And yet our own Department of Agriculture encourages people not to consume meat. Mr. President, I think I'll have more to say about this topic, but for the moment, in light of the kindness that was extended to me by the senators, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Kansas. Normally when you yield the floor to a colleague in the Senate, you're not quite sure how long he's going to speak. So he not only kept his word to speak for less than 3 minutes, but he proved that he continues to have some lingering holdover reflexes from his service in the House of Representatives, where they always speak shorter than we do. Mr. President, what's the pending business?
The motion to proceed to S-3414.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, I rise to support that motion to proceed to S-3414, which is the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, and I do so with the hope and the request that all of our colleagues will vote yes on this motion to proceed, so we can begin what I think is a crucial debate about how best to protect our national and economic security in this wired world where threats increasingly and thefts come not from land, sea, or sky, but in invisible strings of ones and zeros traveling through cyberspace. This bill has been a long time in coming to the floor, and a lot of work has been done on it. But I must say I have a sense of confidence, certainly, about the inclination of the overwhelming majority of members of the Senate to vote to proceed to this matter, because I think everyone in the chamber understands that what we're dealing with here is not a problem that's speculative or theoretical. Anybody who spent any time, not even studying the classified materials on this, but just reading the newspaper, following the media, knows that America is under daily constant cyber attack and cyber theft. The commander of Cyber Command, General Keith Alexander, said recently in a speech that cyber theft represented the largest transfer of wealth in human history. That is, stealing of industrial secrets, moving money from bank accounts. I believe he said that it was just as if we were having our future stolen from us. And it's all happening over cyberspace. And obviously, enemies, both nation states, non-state actors like terrorist groups, organized criminal gangs, and just plain hackers are finding ways to penetrate the cyber systems on which our society depends, the cyber systems that control critical infrastructure, electric grid, transportation system, the whole financial system, the dams that hold back water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this problem, the problem that this bill is not a solution in search of a problem. It is a problem that is real and cries out for the solution that this bill would provide. There's some controversial parts of the bill, and there's been some spirited debate both in committee and in the public media about it. There's a competing bill introduced by some of our colleagues called Secure IT. But I want to report to the Chamber and to the public that there was a significant breakthrough today where the lead co-sponsors of our bill, Senators Collins, Rockefeller, Feinstein, Carper, and I, met with the lead co-sponsors of the other bill, Senators Chambliss, McCain, and Hutchison, along with a group of senators who, led by Senator Kyle and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, along with Senator Coons, Senator Mikulski, Senator Coates, and others, who have been working very hard to create common ground because they recognize the urgency of this challenge. Well, this is good news. We've got a motion to proceed, which in the current schedule will come up on Friday. I think it would send a message of real encouragement to the public that we could still get together across party lines on matters of urgent national security if we adopted that motion to proceed overwhelmingly, particularly now that we're engaged in dialogue with the leaders of the main bills and people trying to bridge gaps that began to meet today will meet again tomorrow morning. So I think we've got a process going that can lead us to a very significant national security accomplishment. I'm going to yield at this time to Senator Rockefeller, the chair of the Commerce Committee, whose committee produced a bill of its own, and he worked very closely with Senator Collins and me to blend our bills. We did. Senator Feinstein came along and with her chairmanship of the Intel Committee of the Senate, did some tremendous work on information sharing provision, Title VII of the bill before us. I know Senator Rockefeller has another engagement that he has to go to, so I'm going to yield to him for his opening statement, then Senator Collins, who's, as always, for all these years, been just the most steadfast, constructive, sturdy, reliable, creative, constructive, I said that already, constructive, didn't I, partner in working on this bill, and gives me confidence that together we're going to see it to success next week. So I would now yield to the distinguished senior senator from West Virginia, who is a real expert on this subject and has contributed enormously to the bill that is pending before the Senate now.
My dear colleague,
the senator from West Virginia.
I would feel better if the senator from Maine spoke before I did.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maine.
that is very kind of the senator from West Virginia. My statement is quite lengthy, so if the senator from West Virginia, in light of his commitment, would like to precede me, I would be more than happy to have him do so. So I would encourage him to go ahead, and then the senator from Connecticut has graciously said that he would allow me to go next. Thank you, Mr. President. Nice around here.
Mr. President.
The senator from West Virginia.
I wish all negotiations proceeded with such comedy. For those of us who've lived long enough, we have seen obviously enormous transitions, and we're in a totally new age. Today, as we begin our debate, over 200 billion emails will be sent around the world to every continent. Google, a company that is really just 10 years old, will process over 1 billion searches and stream more than 2 billion videos today. And in the next minute, about 36,000 tweets will be posted on Twitter. So we're now connected as we never have been before. Here in the United States, we've been a leader in both its development and adoption. And the initial structure actually is interesting because it was created really by our own government, and the open nature of the Internet can be traced back to our initial decision in the government to relinquish control of what we had invented, so to speak. So to this day, our nation remains a leader in using the Internet for innovation and growth. In just over a decade, we've digitalized and networked our entire economy and our entire way of life. Every one of our most critical systems now rely upon these interconnected networks. Power grids, transportation systems, gas pipelines, telecommunications, they all rely on networks to function. They all rely on the Internet. Yet the ramifications of this new era remain poorly understood by many, frankly by most. History teaches us that disruptive technological advancements can bring about both opportunities and also dangers. We cannot let our exuberance blind us from this simple truth. We cannot ignore the part of the equation in this happy adventure of ours that is unpleasant, and this is it. These technological advances can compromise our national security and indeed are already so doing. The connectivity brought about by the Internet and the new ability to access anything, combined with our decision as a country to put everything we hold dear on the Internet, means that we are now vulnerable in ways that were unfathomable just a few years ago. Yes, we rush to digitalize and connect every aspect of the American economy and way of life. And we've spent little time focusing on what this actually means with respect to our security. We've left ourselves extraordinarily vulnerable, and the consequences, as pointed out by the senator from Connecticut, are devastating. Our intellectual property is our greatest asset as a nation. It's our greatest advantage in the world. It's currently being pilfered and stolen because it's connected to the Internet and therefore is unsecured. Well, we didn't think about that, did we? Experts have called this, as the senator from Connecticut said, the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. Dramatic statement, but it's just an absolutely terrifying fact. Terrifying fact. Our most important personal information, including our credit card numbers, our financial data, is now accessible via the Internet and is stolen through data breaches that occur all the time. And most importantly, our critical infrastructure, from water facilities and gas pipelines to our electric power grid and communications network, are now vulnerable to cyber attacks, and they are happening. Many of these systems were designed before the Internet. In fact, virtually all of these systems were designed before the Internet came about and were never intended to be connected to a network. Yet they are, and therefore they are unsecured. If these systems are exploited via cyber vulnerabilities, lives could be lost. Yes, there's lots of other things that could have happened before that, but this has the potential to be far greater than even the tragedy of 9/11. In recent months, we've learned that hackers penetrated the networks of companies that control our nation's pipelines, gas pipelines. There have been attempts to penetrate the networks of companies that run nuclear power plants. And last year, a foreign computer hacker showed that he could access the control systems of a water facility in Texas with ease. He accomplished this task in minutes at a computer thousands of miles away. Our critical infrastructure is being targeted, and it is vulnerable. Our Major General of our National Guard, James Hoyer, recently shared a frightening story with me. He was talking about his work on cybersecurity, and he said in West Virginia he learned that a critical infrastructure facility in the state, critical infrastructure facility, that means a really important one, its engineers were being allowed to operate control systems from their home computers. How naive. But who would know? Who would have guessed? The Internet and what it has done for our country is unparalleled. But everything we have accomplished in this Internet age is now vulnerable and, in starker terms, undoable. We have built a castle in the sand, and the tide is approaching. Our systems are too fragile, too critical, and too vulnerable. It's a recipe for disaster, and it's time to do something about it before it's too late. We've all known about the seriousness of our cyber situation for years. Our national security experts know it. Our law enforcement experts know it. And there's a bipartisan agreement that something needs to be done. But that doesn't tell you a lot to make that statement in the Senate. In my capacity, both as a chairman of the Commerce Committee and former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and still on that committee, I've become very familiar with the threat posed by cybersecurity. And I've been working with my colleagues to address it. For the past 3 years, a number of us have been working with both Republicans and Democratic senators to find common ground on these issues so we can have a bill to get control of this. We've held hearings, we've had markups, we've held countless meetings with the private sector and interest groups. It's an endless, endless process, and that's the staff does 4 times as much. We've been very patient in working to find a compromise, and now is the time to make that compromise happen. It won't happen today. It could happen in the next several days. We know what we need to do, I do believe. So here's what we know right now. The federal government needs to do a better job of protecting its own networks. Companies control most of our nation's critical infrastructure, and they need to do a better job of eliminating cyber vulnerabilities from their systems. There are no clear lines of authority and responsibility in the federal government for cybersecurity, which will cause confusion in the event of a cyber catastrophe. And the private sector and the federal government need to be able to share information about cyber threats. Over the last year, the Committee of Jurisdiction and the Senate have worked together, the committees have worked together to finalize legislation that addresses each of these concerns. Senators Lieberman, Senators Feinstein, Senators Collins, myself have made it a priority, and others, to finish this work together and with a broader group. We believe that every member of this body will be able to support some kind of legislation. We have put legislation before the Senate, but it's subject to change, and in fact may be in the process of changing in a good sense, because we held a long meeting this morning. We're going to have another one tomorrow, perhaps on a daily basis. And the basic thing is that we have taken, what we've done is that we took a more regulated approach. In other words, you have to do this. This is what you should do. This is at what level you should do it. We've taken that away, and we've made it much more voluntary. We've made it a voluntary approach. And some say, well, that's worse than no bill at all, to which I would reply, no, if you incent people properly with a voluntary approach, the pressure to do something is greater, particularly if they have to submit to audits as to the standards of work which they're doing to protect themselves. There are a variety of ways to do this. We could have a council, the DHS council, which would decide what the standard should be. There was some talk this morning about having a convening session called by NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, which is very good at this stuff, to convene the private sector and have those two kind of work out a system. But the NIST has no authority. They have no regulatory authority, so they could just let them come up with their suggestions. And then there was an idea that maybe the DHS could take a look at that and certify it, stamp it with approval or not on basic critical infrastructure. And, of course, you'd have to pick out which was the critical infrastructure, because there's lots of it. And so which one would be subject to special regard is something that we still have to work out. This bill is, however, it works so far, and I think in the future, is bipartisan. There's some sort of tribulation about let's let bygones be bygones. We've all given up and compromised, and to which my point of view is that some of us have really been working on this for a very, very long time, and we've been joined by others who have very, very good ideas. But don't close off the past or the future. The bill will be bipartisan. It will incorporate the good ideas and suggestions that have been made by many of our colleagues. We've settled on a plan that creates no new bureaucracies. However that plan forms, it'll have no new bureaucracies or heavy-handed regulation. That's already understood. It's premised on companies taking responsibility for securing their own networks with government assistance where necessary. This bill represents a compromise, and it's time to move forward with it. I think, in closing, I think back to the year 2000 and 2001. I was on the Intelligence Committee at the time of 9/11. And, you know, the fact is, and we did reports on all of this which have never surfaced, but that we know we did them and we know what the facts were, that there were signs of people moving around the country. And they weren't just sort of haphazardly moving around the country. San Diego, certain safe house in San Diego would appear, and then people that were coming and going from there. Then there was the FBI office in Minneapolis and the Moussaoui case. And then did the FBI office in Minneapolis report to the FBI UBL, Osama bin Laden office in the FBI, and perhaps that didn't happen. We all knew that something was new, and we all knew that the world was getting different, and we knew that danger could come upon us. Our intelligence and national security leadership took these matters very seriously. However, they did not take it seriously enough, nor did we. So then it was too late. 9/11 happened, and the world changed forever. Today we have a new set of warnings flashing before us with a wide range of challenges to our security and safety, and we once again face a choice. Act now and put in place safeguards to protect this country and our people, or act later when it's really too late. Obviously, the conclusion is that we must act now. I thank the Chair and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me thank the Senator from West Virginia for his comments. He has worked so hard on this issue for many years, but in particular the past 3 years, as he and the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Feinstein, have worked with Senator Lieberman and with me. So, Mr. President, I rise this evening to urge our colleagues to vote to begin the debate on the Cybersecurity Act of 2012. Senator Lieberman and I have introduced this bill along with our colleagues, Senator Rockefeller, Senator Feinstein, and Senator Carper. It has been a great pleasure to work with all of them, and work we have in numerous sessions over literally a period of years, as we have attempted to merge the bills that were reported by the Commerce Committee and the Homeland Security Committee. And of course, Mr. President, it is always a great pleasure to once again work with my dear friend, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Senator Lieberman, as we bring forth yet another bipartisan bill to the chamber for its consideration. Mr. President, FBI Director Robert Mueller has warned that the cyber threat will soon equal or surpass the threat from terrorism. He has argued that we should be addressing the cyber threat with the same kind of intensity that we have applied to the terrorist threat. This vital legislation would provide the federal government and the private sector with the tools needed to help protect our country from the growing cyber threat. It would promote information sharing, improve the security of the federal government's own networks, enhance research and development programs, and most important of all, it would help to better secure our nation's most critical infrastructure from cyber attack. These are the power plants, the pipelines, the water treatment facilities, the electrical grid, the transportation systems, the financial networks upon which Americans rely each and every day. The fact is, the computerized industrial controls that open and close the valves and switches in our infrastructure are particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks. Indeed, the Internet is under constant siege on all fronts by nations like China, Russia, and Iran, by transnational criminals, by terrorist groups, by hacktivists, and by persistent hackers. That is why our nation's top national security and homeland security leaders from the current and former administrations have urged us to take legislative action to address this unacceptable risk to both our national security and our economic prosperity. Earlier this year, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta described our bill as, quote, essential to addressing our nation's critical infrastructure and network cybersecurity vulnerabilities, both of which pose serious national and economic security risks to our nation, end quote. Just last month, the Secretary reiterated his call for Congress to pass our bill and stressed the potential for a cyber attack to cripple our critical infrastructure in a way that would virtually paralyze this country. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, has also sounded the alarm. He has described the cyber threat as a profound threat to this country, its future, its economy, its very being. The warnings, Mr. President, have not been confined to officials in the Obama administration. Former national security officials, including Michael Chertoff, Michael McConnell, Paul Wolfowitz, Michael Hayden, have written that the cyber threat is imminent and represents one of the most serious challenges to our national security since the onset of the nuclear age 60 years ago. They have urged us to protect the infrastructure that controls our electricity, water and sewer, nuclear plants, communications backbone, energy pipelines, and financial networks with appropriate cybersecurity standards. Similarly, in a letter to our colleague, Senator John McCain, General Keith Alexander, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency, wrote, given DoD reliance on certain core critical infrastructure to execute its mission, as well as the importance of the nation's critical infrastructure to our national and economic security overall, legislation is also needed to ensure that infrastructure is sufficiently hardened and resilient. Mr. President, the threats to our infrastructure are not hypothetical. They are already occurring. For example, while many of the details are classified, we know that multiple natural gas pipeline companies have been the target of a sophisticated cyber intrusion campaign that has been ongoing since December of last year. The cyber threat to our critical infrastructure is also escalating in its frequency and severity. According to DHS's Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team, last year, almost 200 cyber intrusions were reported by critical infrastructure owners and operators. That is nearly a 400% increase from the previous year. And these are only the intrusions that have been reported to the Department of Homeland Security. Many go unreported, and even worse, many owners are not even aware that their systems have been compromised. What would a successful cyber attack on our critical infrastructure look like? Well, Mr. President, we've just seen recently what a serious storm that leaves more than 1 million people without power can cause. The loss of life, the blow to economic activity, the hardship for the elderly, the non-working traffic lights that resulted in accidents. Multiply that impact many times over if there were a sustained cyber attack that deliberately knocked out our electric grid. The threat is not just to our national security, but also to our economic edge, to our competitiveness. The rampant cyber theft targeting the United States by countries like China has led to the greatest transfer of wealth in history, according to General Alexander. You've heard many of us use his quote. Let me give you some specifics of his estimates. He believes that American companies have lost about $250 billion a year through intellectual property theft, $114 billion to theft through cyber crime, and another $274 billion in downtime the thefts have caused. In their op-ed earlier this year, former DNI McConnell, former Homeland Security Secretary Chertoff, and former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bill Lynn warned that the cost of cyber espionage and theft easily means billions of dollars and millions of jobs. The threat of a cyber attack doesn't just go to our national security, critical though that is. It also directly is a threat to America's ability to compete, to our economic edge. In recent years, a growing number of U.S. firms, including sophisticated firms like Google, Lockheed Martin, RSA, Sony, NASDAQ, and many others have been hacked by malicious actors. Earlier this month, the security firm McAfee released a report on a highly sophisticated cyber intrusion dubbed Operation High Roller, which has attempted to steal more than $78 million in fraudulent financial transfers at least 60 different financial institutions. Trade associations have been attacked too. The Chamber of Commerce was the victim of a cyber attack for many months, blissfully unaware until informed by the FBI that its membership data were being stolen. The evidence of our cybersecurity vulnerability is overwhelming. It compels us to act. Just yesterday, 18 experts in national security strongly endorse the revised legislation that we have introduced. The Aspen Homeland Security Group, made up of officials from both Republican and Democratic administrations and chaired by former Secretary Chertoff and former Congresswoman Jane Harman, urged the Senate to adopt a program of voluntary cybersecurity standards and strong positive incentives for critical infrastructure to implement those standards. And this group called for action on our bill, saying this country is already being hurt by foreign cyber intrusions and the possibility of a devastating cyber attack is real. Congress must act now. Now, Mr. President, you have heard some members of this body say that somehow this process has been rushed or this bill inadequately considered. Nothing could be further from the truth. Since 2005, 7 years ago, our Homeland Security Committee alone has held 10 hearings on cybersecurity. Other Senate committees have also held hearings for a total of 25 hearings since 2009, not to mention numerous briefings that the presiding officer and Senator Mikulski from Maryland have helped to convene, classified briefings for any member to attend. In 2010, Chairman Lieberman, Senator Carper, and I introduced our cybersecurity bill, which was reported by our committee later that same year. As I indicated, we've been working with Chairman Rockefeller to merge our bill with legislation that he has championed, which was reported by the Commerce Committee. We've also worked very closely with Senator Feinstein, an expert on information sharing. The bill that we are urging our colleagues to proceed to today is the product of these efforts. It also incorporates substantial changes based on the feedback from the private sector, our colleagues, and the administration. This new bill is a good faith effort to address the concerns raised by members on both sides of the aisle by establishing a framework that relies upon the expertise of government and the innovation of the private sector. It improves privacy protections that Americans expect from their government. It also reflects many concepts proposed by Senators Kyle, Whitehouse, the presiding officer, Blunt, Coates, Graham, Mikulski, Blumenthal, and Coons. We have revised our bill in a very substantial way. We have abandoned the approach, which I still believe to be a good idea, of mandatory standards, and instead we have adopted a voluntary approach to standards. This is a significant change from our initial bill, and it was one that was promoted by the Senator Kyle and Senator Whitehouse's group. The new version encourages owners of critical infrastructure to voluntarily adopt the cybersecurity practices in exchange for various incentives for entities complying with these best practices. This was also one of the primary recommendations of the House Republican Cyber Task Force. These incentives include liability protection against punitive damages, and I, for one, am open to making that a more robust liability protection. They include the opportunity to receive expedited security clearances eligibility for prioritized technical assistance from the government, and access to timely cyber threat information held by the government. These major changes from the approach that we initially proposed demonstrates our willingness to adopt alternatives recommended in good faith by our colleagues, and we are still open to changes to the bill. Our bill also includes strong information sharing provisions that promote voluntary information sharing within the private sector and the government while ensuring that privacy and civil liberties are protected. And again, we incorporated some suggestions from the Democratic side of the aisle to strengthen these provisions. To be sure, more information sharing is essential to improving our understanding of the risks and threats. But let us be clear, more information sharing, while absolutely essential, is not sufficient to ensure that our nation's vital critical infrastructure is protected. And if you survey the vast majority of experts in this field, they will tell you that to pass a bill that only provides for more information sharing does not begin to accomplish the job that must be done to better secure our nation from this threat. Now, with 85% of our nation's critical infrastructure owned by the private sector, government obviously must work with the private sector. And our bill, both our original bill and our revised bill, has always envisioned a partnership between government and the private sector. We have a very stringent definition of what constitutes covered critical infrastructure. It is infrastructure whose disruption could result in truly catastrophic consequences. Now, what do I mean about that? I'm talking about mass casualties or mass evacuations, or a severe degradation of our national security, or a serious blow to our economy. That's the kind of disruption that we're talking about. So obviously, those who have claimed that every company or every part of our infrastructure is going to be considered as critical infrastructure have not read the definition in our bill. But here's more evidence of why we must act. A study done in 2011 by the computer security firm McAfee and CSIS revealed that approximately 40% of the companies surveyed, the critical infrastructure companies, were not regularly patching and updating their software, despite the fact that these safeguards are among the most basic and widely known cybersecurity risk mitigation practices. We've even found reports where companies haven't bothered to change the default password that came with the industrial control software. In many cases, the control devices used to operate our nation's most critical infrastructure are inherently insecure. A Washington Post special report last month noted that security researchers found that 6 out of 7 control system devices are, quote, riddled with hardware and software flaws, end quote. and that some included backdoors that enabled hackers to download passwords or sidestep security completely. Another front-page story in the Post earlier this month highlighted the fact that as technological advances have allowed everyone from plant managers to hospital nurses to control their systems remotely via the Internet, these vital systems have become even more vulnerable to cyber attacks. To prove the point, the story described how a security researcher was able to easily steal passwords from a provider that connects millions of these systems to the Internet. Mr. President, these examples illustrate that far too many critical infrastructure owners are not taking even the most basic measures to protect their systems. And this is simply dangerous and unacceptable to the security of our country. These basic practices need not be expensive. In most cases, they're not expensive. And I'll tell you, they're a lot less costly than the consequences of a breach, not to mention a major cyber attack. A recent report by Verizon, the Secret Service, and other international law enforcement agencies analyzed 855 data breaches and found that 96 were not difficult to pull off, and 97% of them could have been prevented through fairly simple and inexpensive means. Mr. President, the point is we must act, and we must act now. We cannot afford to wait for a cyber 9/11 before taking action on this legislation. In all the years that I have been working to identify vulnerabilities facing our country in the area of homeland security, I cannot identify another area where I believe that the threat is greater and that we have done less. I urge my colleagues to listen